Hi, everyone, and welcome to this screencast. My name is Axel Bruns, and with me is my colleague Tobias Keller, who is a visiting postdoc at Queensland University of Technology. We are talking about news diffusion on Twitter, and we've been investigating the dissemination careers of news content on Twitter. I will go quite quickly through this because we've only got a very limited amount of time, of course, but you can see these slides and the full content, of course, online as well. We are prompted here by studies like this about the speed with which true and false information disseminate online. And we think there's actually more to be said about this than just saying that false information, misinformation disseminates more quickly than real information on Twitter. So this is what we're investigating here. So how do stories from different types of outlets disseminate across Twitter? Are there real differences between different types of outlets? Is there any evidence of bots or other inauthentic activities or even coordinated authentic activities going on that we can see for these different outlets? That's really what we're investigating here. We're using a number of data sources here at QUT. We've got two long-standing data sources that track the sharing of links to Australian outlets, about 35 of those, or to about 1,400 outlets on various lists of fringe news sites on Twitter on an ongoing basis. And we've selected the 4 most shared Australian news outlets and the 10 most shared outlets in fringe news, which break down to some extent into further individual language versions. And we're looking here at content from 2019. Without any further ado, let's get started. Our process here again is described in some more detail on the slide here, but I'm actually going to show you this in a visual form to make it a bit easier. What we are essentially calculating for each story that we're tracking from any of these outlets is the dissemination curve over time. So from the first tweet during 2019 all the way through to the end to 2 months after that first tweet, we are tracking the volume of tweets sharing that particular URL. We're describing this as a percentage of the total number of tweets by these 2 months. And we are tracking this here as a logarithmic curve to see in some more detail what happens in the first minutes versus the later parts of the dissemination curve. So this is what it looks like for a single story. So from the first minute all the way through to the end, this is how this content disseminates on Twitter to 100%. That's the total after 2 months. Now, if we do this for one story, it looks like this. Again, sorry, the logarithmic scale there as well. If we do this for one story, it looks like this. If we do it for all of the stories by this particular outlet, ABC News, the public broadcaster in Australia, then it looks like this. And we're seeing quite clearly there are some stories that disseminate quite a bit more quickly in the first few minutes after they were first shared. And they get to almost 100% very, very quickly here, within 200 minutes in some cases. And there are some stories that are much slower in disseminating. They are essentially sleeper stories. They might appear quickly, but take some significant amount of time until they reach the full number of shares after 2 months. That's what it looks like for a single site. And of course, then we can generate an average dissemination curve from all of this that brings all of this together into one single curve. And that essentially is the typical curve for content from the ABC as it disseminates on Twitter over the first 2 months of its existence. Now, doing this for multiple sites and comparing this is what it looks like for these 10 fringe news sites and 4 mainstream news sites. The mainstream Australian news sites here are shown in bold, and the other ones are shown in thinner lines. So this is the total comparison between the average dissemination curves for all of these sites. I'll highlight a few things here. The ethnic sites, the Australian news sites, mainstream news sites, are largely in the midfield of this comparative graph, with just the conversation straggling a little bit, disseminating generally slower. We have some of the fringe news sites from Raw Story, Gateway Pundit, and some of the Russian state media sites, particularly in Turkish, Spanish, and Arabic, that disseminate quite quickly and more quickly than most of the other sites. We've got a handful of sites, including The Conversation, which is ultimately a scholarly news site, and Judicial Watch, which we might describe as hyperpartisan lawfare, disseminating a lot more slowly than the other sides. So this might be because of their specialist type of content that just doesn't disseminate as quickly as other types of content do. But largely, there is a lot of similarity between all of these sites. And in fact, this is, again, just for background, this is the time to selected milestones, 10%, 25%, 50%, 75% of the total, on average, of the total dissemination for these sites. And what we're seeing here is particularly just comparing the ABC, the national broadcaster in Australia. It compares roughly as, it disseminates roughly as quickly as Breitbart content does. So a very different side, a much more hyperpartisan news side. While Daily Caller disseminates more quickly to 10%. After that, again, it's very similar to the ABC. And even Russia Today, although it disseminates quite quickly early on, by 50%, it's roughly at the same speed as the ABC. And the ABC actually compares also quite well with Sputnik News, another Russian state-sponsored site. And Sputnik then disseminates more slowly after the first 25% of the full dissemination curve have been reached. So the ABC is actually faster than Sputnik News on average in disseminating its stories on Twitter. Now, handing over to Tobias to talk more about the presence or not of bots in all of this.
Yeah, thank you, Axel. So we were curious what role social bots played in the dissemination of news articles, and we therefore used two machine learning algorithms, TweetBot-2 and Bottometer. We only showed the results from TweetBot-2 because of the limited time, but it's important to acknowledge that both tools are far from perfect and have several issues. However, these tools are useful to get an overview of large data sets. So we selected a stratified random sample of 10,000 unique Twitter accounts per outlet, and we'll show density plots to compare the results per outlet and also show a few of those detected bots. Now, as you can see on this density plot, there are almost no fully automated accounts sharing news. More than 99% of all accounts have a score lower than 0.1, meaning these are human-controlled accounts. And less than 1% of accounts received a score higher than 0.5, which means they behave like known bots. We also see almost no difference between mainstream news sites, the four on the bottom, and the marginal or fringe news sites, the ones above. So there's not much going on in terms of fully automated bots spreading news articles. But let's have a look at those bots that we did find. Now, a first glimpse shows that many of these accounts are fully automated, so TweetBot-2 works quite well. And I'll show you a few examples. First, here are a few examples of those bots that spread fringe or marginal news site articles. The most interesting of these ones is probably the one in the middle, the Shadow Donald Trump, who just copies and tweets everything the real Donald Trump Twitter account does. So this account is fully automated and happened to spread news from the Daily Caller. Now let's have a look at those bots that share mainstream news sites. The main difference that we found initially is that those accounts are way more transparent about being bots. So for example, if we look at the one on the left side that spread ABC News, it is described as the fastest bot publishing stories from Hacker News. And on the very right side, we see Johan Rodriguez, someone with a PhD in nanotechnology. He labels those tweets that were sent automatically with hashtag automated. So in sum, this first exploratory analysis seems to indicate that bots that spread mainstream news articles seem to be more transparent about being bots, whereas those spreading marginal news sites seem to be more in disuse. However, we have to analyze this systematically to provide more evidence for this claim.
So overall, what we're finding with all of this is that mis and disinformation, or fringe news more generally, doesn't really disseminate any faster than real or mainstream news. Both types of sites get to the full dissemination that they have after two months from the first post, roughly in the same time. The curves are actually quite similar. there are differences more between different types of sites in either of these categories than there are between fringe news sites and mainstream news sites as such. We've seen that some of the specialist side particularly disseminate somewhat more slowly than others, and some of the more breaking news sites perhaps disseminate more quickly than others, and that's as it should be, of course, but that has nothing much to do with whether these sites are fully mainstream or fringe news sites, or even err on the side of mis and disinformation. So this is really quite a counterpoint to some of these studies that seem to say that fake news disseminates more quickly than real news. I think this needs to be further tested. Of course, there is, as I said, there is some evidence of perhaps authentic or inauthentic coordinated activity, but again, we're not finding very many automated accounts at all. And there are no real differences between mainstream and fringe sites here. If fringe news do disseminate at times more quickly, then that might be perhaps because there are some bots there that typical bot detection algorithms don't detect, or in fact that genuine hyperpartisan supporters are actually very active and very committed to spreading news from their favorite sites as well. But that also, of course, might apply to some news sites that have very strong supporting communities, mainstream news sites. So at the moment, this study is still limited, of course, to major Australian sites, mainstream sites, and US fringe media sites. It's limited to a particular year. There's much more here that we can still do with all of this. In particular, we can extend this analysis further to different types of sites, to different types of stories, to perhaps look at particular types of bots as well. And of course, these patterns may also look quite different, and we acknowledge that at times of particularly heightened activity, the bushfires we've had in Australia at the start of 2020, the current COVID-19 crisis, of course. So here we might see some very different stories, and this is one of the next steps that we'll pursue here as well. Overall, it's quite clear that we need more than just this time series analysis as well, of course, to further investigate the full picture. But that's it from us for the moment. And we thank, of course, the funders that have supported this work as well. So thank you very much. And our full slides will be online as well.